Janice Fiamengo, welcome back to Planet Waves TV.
Thank you very much, Eric. Glad to be here.
It's good to have you. I'm so happy that you are in the world doing your scholarship. In another lifetime, I would become a grad student and write a PhD thesis about your work. But now I get to be your friend and your colleague, and that's wonderful.
Well, I sometimes feel lately that I have written particularly for you because you really get what I was
Well,
trying to do for all
I
those
try to give you
years.
that feeling that I've
Very
been there
nice feeling.
to receive that to receive this message, which is a reassessment of the philosophy of feminism.
Yes. Hmm.
Right,
Yeah.
that's
And
fair
I
to say that,
was,
right?
yes, I had always assumed, as I think most people do, that there was a good feminism at some point in the late 18th century and the, early to mid to late 19th century, that women were campaigning for their socio-political rights, and that it was a very reasonable movement, and that something went wrong
Hmm.
later on. Well,
Hmm.
not everybody believes that it ever went wrong, of course, but some people think that it got harsher. It became quite anti-male. It became female supremacist at a later point in the 20th century. And I was shocked to discover the depth of anti-male rancor in the early feminist thought.
Right. I mean, it's plain to see, as you've
Sure
pointed out
is.
in your
Yeah.
Fiamengo. I binge watched the entire Fiamengo Files 2.0 in one weekend. It was like it was like watching Twin Peaks or something. Astounded astounded at the attitudes we're gonna talk about here. So this is a nothing against women presentation, nothing against women. And as you know, I tend to favor women. I, like a
Hmm.
lot of men,
Like a lot of
am
men, yeah.
inclined to like women and to give them a lot of room to be themselves. And I've always spent my entire life supporting women any way that I could, holding doors open and teaching them skills that had been normally reserved for men, at least in theory. And somehow I'm not I'm not a feminist. I've turned in my resignation, sent my card back to Washington D.C. Okay, so
Yeah, well, that's a good thing. I don't think it's good to support an ideology of collective vengeance. The notion of collective punishment led to anything good. It is not a good philosophy for a just and caring society, and that's
yes,
what feminism is, as I've discovered.
yes.
Yeah.
So I was in Seneca Falls a few weeks ago. I made a pilgrimage and passed through the Presbyterian church relics, whatever Methodist was. What church was it? Was it some kind of a church?
Tell you the truth, I don't know. I don't know what kind it was exactly.
Where the first women's rights conference is claimed to have been held. There were others. This is,
Yeah.
but this is the official, official starting point.
Yes.
And we're told, and the sign's up on the thing, the New York State Department of whatever history sign. And I had to go there and feel the vibes. And then now we're here having this conversation. So what happened? What was going on in the mid 19th century, first of all, in the United States, in the New World, basically, and then what happened at Seneca Falls?
Yeah, well, mid 19th century, as you know, probably better than I, was a very revolutionary time. There were many documents being produced at that time, many revolutions going on in Europe, and the revolutionary sentiment that they were inspired by was a part and parcel of the culture of the United States as well. As we know, the Communist Manifesto was published in 1848, the same year as the Declaration of Sentiments
Oh,
at Seneca Falls. So that's kind of interesting. It was a year of revolution with a great deal of talk of rights in the air. And yeah, what was going on in the United States in particular? It was the era of the anti-slavery movement, for example, when many, mostly religious people, Quakers in particular, were very concerned about the moral issue of slavery. And the women that were interested in today, in particular, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who was not a Quaker, but married a man when she was 25, who was very active in the anti-slavery movement, and became friendly with a number of radical Quaker women, particularly Sarah Grimke, who wrote extensively about the need to abolish slavery and also about women's rights in relation to the anti-slavery movement, and the radical Quaker Lucretia Mott. She met those women on her honeymoon. She and her husband went to London to attend the World Anti-Slavery Conference. One of the things that happened at that conference was that they seated the women separate from the men. And this absolutely outraged these women. And so at that time, Elizabeth Cady, who had married Henry Stanton, so she's Cady Stanton. Well, she, I guess, called herself Elizabeth Stanton for much of her life, but she began talking with these Quaker women about women's rights. And when she and her husband returned to New York, she began speaking out on the issue, and she loved it. And it's interesting that she enjoyed it so much. She wrote at one point that she got so wrapped up in her own speech about women's wrongs and women's rights that she wept on stage. And I just thought, wow, I could never do that. I'm paralyzed with nervousness anytime I speak. And the last thing I could ever do would be to work myself up into such a passion that I cried. So this is a woman who enjoyed public display, was at ease with it, and I think, was quite exhilarated by the opportunity to express righteous and, dare we say, self-righteous anger. So throughout the 1840s, then, when she was in her late 20s, she was born in 1815. So in her late 20s and early 30s, she became a women's rights agitator, and that was already an issue. There was already a lot of talk about the wrongs of marriage, how women were referred or assumed to be property in marriage. There was a great deal of agitation about married women's property rights. All discussion of the relations of the sexes was very much in the air, and there were a lot of people interested in the issue. So then Cady Stanton and her Quaker friends decided to organize this big conference and to invite a whole variety of people. Hundreds of people did assemble at Seneca Falls, and they wrote a document. Cady Stanton herself primarily wrote the document, which I think was then revised during the couple of days that the meeting took place. They modified the various statements and demands that were in that declaration. They called it the Declaration of Sentiments. It's considered the founding document of the American women's rights movement. With Cady Stanton went on to become the leader. She was the acknowledged leader along with Susan B. Anthony for the next 50 years. She didn't die until 1902. And the Declaration of Sentiments is based on the Declaration of Independence. It largely takes the whole first paragraph of the Declaration of Independence and, puts woman and man in there, where in the place of the States and Great Britain. And its thesis is that the entire history of humankind is the history of man oppressing woman. And then everything that follows in the document is an elaboration on that idea. And so the thesis is that the history of mankind is a history of repeated injuries and usurpations on the part of man toward woman, having as its direct object the establishment of an absolute tyranny over her.
That sounds pretty rough. What was the truth of the matter at that time? Oh, your screen's frozen up a little bit.
Cady Stanton ever wrote, and she wrote voluminously. Nothing. I just got a message, Eric, saying my internet connection is unstable. So if I freeze, I know this happened once before,
Yep.
I'll get back
Yeah, let's
online
go back
immediately.
let's go back about 10 seconds.
Oh, did I already freeze?
Yeah,
Okay.
you were frozen.
Oh, that's so
The
annoying.
patriarchy at
Hmm.
Zoom
Yes.
just hit pause on
Yeah.
your side of the
Um,
conversation.
yeah. So what was I, at what point did I
So
freeze?
we got as far as the establishment of the absolute tyranny as
Yes.
its one and only goal.
Yes, that's the only goal of the patriarchy of man against woman. And there's nothing in the document to suggest that men ever acted with goodwill towards women, or that, the realities of biology, or or just of the exigencies of human life in nature
Hmm.
had any role to play in the kinds of social arrangements that evolved. It was all right from the very beginning. The notion was that men were um, men had a power lust, and that's it, that's what motivated everything that they did.
Right. Yeah. And these were not easy times to live in. I mean, there were not toilet bowls. The our world was agrarian. People were not
This was.
really too many people living in cities at that point. Even the cities were quite crude, and it was a scramble for survival,
Yes,
as I
it's
understand it,
certain.
and even into the 20th century till today. But let's go like prehistoric, the late 18th, late 19th, early 20th. A lot of milking the cows going on.
Yes, indeed. I mean, just surviving was very difficult. It involved massive amounts of labor. It made sense for there to be a kind of division of labor in which men did the work outside of the home. It was dangerous outside of the home. It was dangerous to be in cities. It was dangerous to be traveling on roads. The work was extremely difficult. Married women were often either pregnant or nursing their children. Many families had a dozen children. This is, of course, in the era before antibiotics, before the birth control pill, before the welfare state. The division of labor between the home and outside of the home made sense when there was just so much sheer labor to be done to keep a family alive. Of course, infant mortality was very high. Diseases were a serious concern. Even a cold, of course, or a broken arm could be fatal because of the lack of advanced
Mhm.
medical technology. So, yeah, it was a very difficult life for many women. Still, at the time, had a greater lifespan than men did. Katie Stanton herself lived a great many years to be nearly 90 years old. Her husband died much earlier than she did, as is, of course, not very common in cases where a privileged person oppresses a non-privileged
Hmm.
person. It's not
Hmm.
usually the case that the non-privileged oppressed person outlives their oppressor, as a regular matter of course. So, yes, life was very, very difficult for both men and women. And it's striking how much animus there is in the Declaration of Sentiments, and the refusal to admit all of the ways in which all male parliaments enacted laws specifically to protect women.
Hmm.
Throughout the late 18th century and the early 19th century in the United States, laws were continually being passed to protect women, to protect women's rights in marriage, their rights in divorce, their rights over their children, their education rights, to raise the age of consent, all sorts of things that women lobbied for. There were women's groups. It's nonsense to imagine that women had no voice in the culture of the United States. This was a culture that was very interested in educating as many people as possible, making it possible for them to read the Bible. It was a very religious culture, believed, it was a Protestant religious culture that believed it was very important that people be able to read the Word of God and come to salvation on their own. So that meant educating children. And Elizabeth Cady Stanton herself was educated. She went to the Troy Seminary, which was a higher education institute that wanted women to have the same kind of educational opportunities that upper middle class men had. Of course, lower class people did not have these educational opportunities. Neither sex had them. But for middle class and upper middle class people, there were many colleges that existed to make sure that women were educated in mathematics and science and literature to the same degree that men were.
Right. So pretty much on its face, the Declaration of Sentiments, which I will link to with this, is not reality based.
Well, I don't
Just
think it's
being,
reality based at all. And the very fact that many highly educated women organized and attended the conference gives the lie to the thesis of the conference. If their men and men in general had wanted to keep women, to establish an absolute tyranny over them, that phrasing is taken from the Declaration of Independence, so perhaps it was a little bit tongue in cheek, but still, that's the phrasing they used. Um, the, if they had wanted to prevent that conference from going forward because they wanted to establish an absolute tyranny, they could have done it very, very easily. Instead, men encouraged their women to attend. Men themselves attended, and men themselves signed this, what I think is an incendiary declaration of war on mankind. Men themselves signed it, which I find quite striking. I wouldn't sign a document that said that my sex had done unspeakable things to the people I loved in my life. I mean, they were essentially declaring war against their fathers, husbands, and sons. And men went along with it. So I think that already indicates something about the social and psychological power that women had in this society, and also the irrational anger that they nevertheless felt, and felt it was their right to express.
so what they say essentially is that all women are the victim of all men and always have been.
Yes. Yeah, that's what it says.
And they're
Yeah.
leaving out like 20,000 things.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, many of the specific items that they present in the document are factually untrue or tell only part of the
So
story.
let's check a couple of those out because
Yeah.
that was our plan A. I've got my copy here, printed on extra durable paper.
Yeah, I have my copy too. So really, almost every single one of them is not quite right. Some of them are not factually untrue, but they leave out so much important
So,
context to
so point
understand.
one, he never permitted her to exercise her inalienable right to the elective franchise. Now, women voted in local elections. I
That's
believe it was only federal elections that men voted only exclusively at that
yes.
time.
Yes. So that isn't,
Some men
yes,
voted
some
that
men.
who
Yes, there were
could.
always, yes, there was not universal suffrage at this time. There were qualifications, there were property qualifications, there were income qualifications. Many men were excluded from the elective franchise at this time. So, right on the face of it, this is a distorted Manichaean worldview of oppressor and oppressed that isn't actually true. And it is true that women did vote they voted like at school board elections, municipal elections. That was common. And again, it was based on the idea that these were the things that women cared about.
Mhm.
I mean, another huge issue that we won't be able to cover today is that this whole idea that women desperately wanted, or that a majority of women, or even a significant minority of women, were deeply angry about their exclusion from the right to vote, and that this struck everyone as a terrible injustice, is simply not true.
Mhm.
The suffrage movement never had the support of even a bare majority of women. In fact, the notion that the exclusion of women from the franchise was a source of deep anger to women, that a majority of women felt this was a demonstrable injustice, is simply not true. Even after decades of campaigning, even suffrage leaders admitted that only about 1/3 at most of women were interested in the right to vote at the federal level. Most women either were indifferent or actively opposed it. And there's a whole interesting, there's a history of anti-suffrage advocates, and they were not conservative women. They were not retrograde women who didn't want women to have rights. Many of these women, of course, expected that women should be educated, they should have property rights, they should have legal rights, all of those things, which they did have, and which were being strengthened all of the time. But they just didn't think that voting in particular was the best way to political power. They believed it was actually better for women to be nonpartisan and to go directly to the legislators and make their various demands or present their various, petitions. And so that's a whole other issue. But it was generally understood by both women and men of this time that women were not that interested in national politics and international affairs, but that women should, of course, have a voice in things that affected them and their children. And they did indeed have that kind of voice. There was also another issue which I think is worth mentioning, which is that throughout the 19th century, it was it was understood that that politics was war waged by other means, as that famous statement is. That the ballot was a kind of substitute bullet. In other words, that voting also carried with it the obligation to defend one's country in time of war, or to take up arms, indeed, as happened, during the Civil War, if there was an internal political, division, and that only those who would have the obligation to risk life and limb for country should also have the ballot. And women not having the obligation to risk life and limb in war often were not interested in that particular arena.
The federal ballot.
So,
This is very important because to this day, women are unlikely to be conscripted in the event of a draft.
almost certainly not.
And like, 50 women died in the Vietnam War, 55,000 men died in the Vietnam War. It's quite disproportionate. And
Yes.
so there were the local women, we're only on the first one. Women could vote, we'll be finished at about midnight. Women could vote in local elections where there was a direct impact. In the United States, at that time, the only direct elections were the House of Representatives. The president is to this day still voted by electors. The voting for we don't even talk about this very much, but the voting for president is by elector. Electors are sent to the thing that happened on January 6th or whatever it is. And the senators were elected by state legislators and sent to Washington by state legislators. So the federal ballot is almost a joke in the mid 1850s. And you're saying that even by the time of the 20th Amendment, is that right?
19th Amendment.
In 1920, that only a third of women wanted the vote. And she has the word never. This is my issue, is the use of the word never. If we rewrote this, to be honest, it would say there are certain circumstances where women do not have the right to vote, particularly in certain federal elections, but we do have the right to vote in local elections. And we feel that the right to vote in federal elections comes with the right to serve, the responsibility to serve in the military. Would be a lot longer. It's only about 8 words.
Yes.
Okay, so we get the idea here, and I think we're going to see this pattern. He has compelled her to submit to laws in the formation of which she had no voice, but this is almost all of us.
Yes, of course.
I don't think I have never given my consent ever to any law that pertains to me.
Yes. And that's just nonsense. That many men, of course, were also without the vote, so we're submitting to these laws. If you even imagine that voting alone means that you have a say, and it was simply not true. Like, this is all in a sense that it implies that no one cared about women. The husbands did not care about their wives. The fathers didn't care about their
Would never
children,
act in
and
their
they didn't.
best interest, right? This
Yeah,
is also
would
saying
not.
within the
Yes,
family structure, it's saying that there was not even any representation. The women had absolutely no power within the
yes,
family structure. This is
exactly.
manifestly false.
Yes. Hmm. And
Women
it's
were,
also, yeah, it's manifestly false because of course men cared about the women in their families.
yes,
Of course they
to
did.
start with, yes.
They of course they did. And it is also manifestly false in the sense that there were women's clubs. Women did lobby for issues, and you can look at the history of laws that were passed. If we want to stick to the United States alone, we can look at the history of laws that were passed to protect women who worked in factories, to change the number of hours that they worked, to protect married. If you look up Married Woman's Property Act, you will see that starting in the 1830s, even before this document was written, and continuing through the 1840s and 1850s and on throughout the 19th century, there were laws passed by every state to protect women's property rights in marriage. That was one of their,
The tour guide
primary.
at, okay, the guard at the sanctuary of women's whatever of sanctimoniousness said that if a woman divorced in 1848, her husband even owned all of her clothing. Everything, the clothes on her back, she owned nothing. Is this true?
Well, that is not true, and the signers of this declaration knew it wasn't true. They had themselves participated just a few months earlier in passing the New York State Married Woman's Property Act that guaranteed women's property rights in marriage. So that was
Months or
simply
months
not.
before the Seneca
Months
Falls
before.
Convention. Not
Yes,
months after,
yes.
months before.
No, months before. It was in March. I encourage everyone to look it up. New York Married Woman's Property Act. It is there. They knew about it and they lied about it in the declaration. And men were never so terrible. There were, if you read the British barrister Ernest Belfort Bax, who started writing a little later in time in the 1870s and 1880s, he made the claim that in fact in British common law, which was largely also adopted by United States legislators, that in British common law there were all sorts of special protections for women. It was understood that women were particularly vulnerable and that men cared about that vulnerability and wanted to enact laws to protect women because women were obviously of essential importance in English society. And so yes, it's just a complete misrepresentation. And also I there are some of these statements that are not entirely untrue. It is true that what the next one, I think, no, it's not there, but just in general, it's coming up about how the fact that once a woman married, she essentially became the property of her husband. That's
Well,
one,
civilly
we hear
dead.
that.
Civil death. This I
That's
learned
it,
about in high
civil
school.
death.
Civil death.
Yeah, civil death. It is true that under English common law, man and woman in marriage become one person, and essentially that person is the husband. But it is not true that that meant that nobody cared about women or that women could be abused by their husbands. It's true that some husbands did abuse their women, but under the law, it was understood that men had many obligations to their wives to support them and to pay all of their debts. They had many financial responsibilities to their families that explain many of the laws that seem unjust to our ears now. But what they really meant was that, well, in Britain anyway, I don't know about in the United States, but I assume it's true there too. Men went to debtors' prisons because they couldn't pay off their wives' debts in some cases. And you would never send a woman to debtor's prison.
Hmm.
Men couldn't stand the thought, then as
Hmm.
now. The law applied differently to men and women. Men had responsibilities, including, of course, the right to defend one's country. They had responsibilities that women didn't have. And so, yes, it may seem unfair, especially if you only look at the woman's side of it. But the man, it was also quite unfair to the man. It meant that a man whose wife left him, claiming that he was abusive, he was still obligated to pay for her support under the law. So, it was a different understanding of men and women's relationship, but it was not necessarily misogynistic in any way.
Right, or intended to create an enslavement. All we ask is you get your foot off our throat, or something like this.
Exactly. That's Sarah Grimke. Yes. Uh-huh. Yeah.
Right.
No, they didn't have their boots on women's throats. Yeah. So yeah, so that whole thing about representation, those are the next few the women have no representation in the halls of legislation. All of that is not really correct. It's a contextless kind of statement for sure.
Right. I mean, this is all
Yeah.
leading me to one overwhelming question, as Prufrock said. Let's say let's read another one. Well, the laws of divorce, we've addressed this. You're saying that they're not okay. This point, which they're not numbered. He so framed the laws of divorce as to
Mhm.
what shall be the proper causes of divorce in case of
Yes.
separation, to whom the guardianship of the children shall be given, as to be wholly regardless of the happiness of women. The law, in all cases, going upon the false supposition of the supremacy of man and giving all power into his hands.
Yes. Now, a lot of this was about to change actually with the tender years doctrine. Later in the 19th century, it became standard practice in law that in a case of divorce or separation, a mother would be the one who had the care of particularly young children, because it was understood that, or it was thought that women were better guardians, especially of young children. Before that, it was understood that the father was the guardian and that he was the one who should have custody of children in case of divorce. And of course, divorce was quite rare. Really, only the upper middle class could afford it. And it had to be for cause. It wasn't until the late 1960s that we had no fault divorce brought in. So there were, I think three major causes: cruelty and desertion, and I forget the third one
Well,
now,
adultery, is
but
that desertion? Is adultery desertion?
you're right. Adultery was the third. Yes. And so it was understood at that time that men should have custody of children. That's
Right.
that's what's primarily being complained about. That's a whole other issue. Of course, now it's widely accepted that women should have custody, and they do get custody in, I think, something like 85% of cases of contested divorce,
Mhm.
and simply on the idea that women are more important to children. Every study that's been done suggests that actually that isn't true. That children of single mothers, do much worse in every possible index, whether it's dropping out of school, having mental health problems, becoming involved in criminal activity, substance abuse, alcoholism, whatever it happens to be. Uh,
Without the father there.
Without the father there, it's a disaster for children. And in fact, single fathers do not have those outcomes. So it isn't even that two parents do better. Of course they do, but single fathers do better than single mothers. And so that's a whole other issue. Of course, I'm not an expert on it, but the notion that the father was the one who should look after children, be responsible for them. And there were reasons, of course, because fathers had the financial abilities that women tended not to have, as Ernest Belfort Bax points out too, in cases of divorce where the woman could prove cruelty or desertion or anything like that, the man would be legally obligated to sustain and that support that woman and her children in cases where she divorced him for cause.
Okay, so again, the
Um,
statement is completely
the statement
distorted.
is not true. It's distorted. But yeah, it only applies in a case where a man divorced his wife for cause because she was adulterous, let's say, and then he would have custody of the children, and that changed in the later 19th century to
Okay,
favor
so you're
single
saying that,
mother.
wait. So this one here, the he has so framed the laws of divorce, this one, only pertains when the man got a divorce for cause from the woman, for example, adultery, and in the event that she divorced him for cruelty or adultery or something like that, he would still be obligated to support her and the children.
That's my understanding.
This is a total, then this is a complete
Yeah,
lie.
I do not claim to be a legal expert, but certainly from my reading of Ernest Belfort Bax talking about English common law, yes, the law was framed that if the woman divorced her husband for cause, he would be obligated to support her and her children.
Okay, let's just do a couple of more because we're seeing this pattern repeating throughout all of these all of these claims.
Mm-hmm. Can we go back to the one just before
Sure,
that one
absolutely.
Because it just makes me laugh. He has made her morally an irresponsible
This
being.
one I skipped over. This is the funniest one of all.
It's the funniest one. So she can commit many crimes with impunity, provided they be done in the presence of her husband. I don't think actually they did have to be in the presence of her husband. In the covenant of marriage, she's compelled to promise obedience. Blah blah blah. That's the other thing. Yes, she was compelled to promise obedience. I wonder how many women actually practiced obedience. He was also compelled to provide, as we just said. So it went both ways. They both promised in the covenant of marriage. He promised to give all his worldly goods to his wife to support her with the labor of his body, sometimes in body destroying labor. So there was another side to it, but that first one, so they're complaining about that the
Yeah.
law was soft on women. I mean, come on,
Yeah.
so that's a form of oppression. I've never heard of an oppressed person complaining before that the law is so constituted that they can commit crimes with impunity. Look how oppressed I am. And Ernest
I can
Belfort
murder,
Bax
I can
talks,
drown my
I
baby
can
with
murder.
impunity.
Yeah, I can drown my baby with impunity. And they did. They did indeed, and were
Yes.
not held responsible. And this is still the case today. Women are not held responsible under law for all sorts of crimes that men are harshly punished by. That has been proven over and over again, particularly in the research of Sonia Starr, University of Michigan professor. But yes, it's a very odd complaint to make. It shows that it's true that in some ways women were not considered, fully responsible adults.
Right.
Okay, and I can see why they might object to that, but it is not a sign of oppression. It is not a sign of male hunger for power and desire to subjugate. It has to do with men's perception of female vulnerability, and female vulnerability, really. That is what it comes down to. And that male legislators, all male juries, male judges couldn't bring themselves in many cases to have women charged with crimes or convicted of crimes or imprisoned for crimes. And it's fascinating, the legal history in the United States of women who killed their children. Very common, women killing children, especially under young 1 year old, and being let off for various reasons, and being let off from other crimes as well, by claiming that they were led into a life of crime by men, by claiming that in some way they were coerced, by claiming that they were victimized, and that worked.
Oh. So basically, this is not so much a lie, but it is like, why are you complaining about this in this oh so important declaration?
It's very
that,
odd.
that you are the complete victim. A couple of months ago, I sent you the article about the woman. I think she killed 5 of her children, and she's sitting in the happily doesn't want to leave the mental ward. She embroiders or something like that.
Yes, yes, and you can read about very similar cases in the 19th century as well. Women committing horrific crimes. Ernest Belford Bax talks about this as well. A woman who killed her husband would often claim that she killed him because he was abusive, and she would be found not responsible. Of course, that still happens today. There are female feminist activists who want to make that part of the law. You don't even have to prove abuse. You simply have to allege it and convince
Hmm.
a jury, and that's the way the woman gets away with murder. Men can't do that.
Yeah,
People
Eve, the
would,
all
you
temptress,
know,
led me to do this.
hmm doesn't work that way. So again, it's a strange kind of abuse of power on the part of men, that women are so much less harshly punished, even for horrific crimes.
Right. Just to put a sharper point on this, if women were indeed the oppressed class, they might suffer greater penalties
Of course.
for similar acts. Right?
Yes, especially against the oppressor class.
Yes,
Yeah,
right.
so yes, it's simply an outrageous kind of. This is a good example of them telling on themselves, really. Look at us. We can commit crimes with impunity because we're
Telling on
victims.
themselves.
Yeah, that's pretty interesting. Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah. Uh-huh.
he's created a false public sentiment by giving the world a different code of morals for men than for women.
Yes,
Let's hold.
that's
Let's
true.
just check. Let's just get that. What is the different code of morals?
I think what they meant there, it's not really clear, but I think what they meant is that sexual morality uh, applied differently.
That men could
And I
go
think,
carousing and whoring, and women had to stay
yes,
home and keep their knees together.
essentially. Yeah, I think yes, it meant that a woman who was sexual before marriage was to some extent disgraced. Not in all cases, of course, but I think it is true that the expectation of chastity for a woman was different from that for a man. I think that's true. And in marriage, I think if I'm remembering correctly, the laws about divorce held that a man could divorce his wife for adultery alone. A woman could not divorce her husband for adultery alone. She could divorce him for desertion. She could divorce him for cruelty, but not for. It would have to be adultery combined with another cause. So I can see their point. That's true. That's true, and it's still true. To some small degree today, that to call a woman a whore is quite different from saying a man is promiscuous or whatever.
Well,
Although now,
okay,
of
so
course,
the
we have a
slut
whole,
shaming thing,
uh,
however,
mm,
we get the eruptions like the Me Too movement, which is
of
essentially
course,
two
yeah,
two years of nonstop slut
yes,
shaming.
exactly, yes, absolutely. Although always in a different way, the claim was that what was going on was really abuse of some form. But simply on the basis of sexual morality itself, I think it is still, to a small extent, true what they were complaining about then, which was more true then. However, there were other moral laws that applied to men that didn't apply to women, and they're not mentioned here, of course. The charge of cowardice.
And
Do you
this is
think
World War One.
any
World War One. This
yes,
was one of the most stunning. The White Flower
the
campaign,
white feather
the White
campaign,
Feather
indeed,
campaign.
indeed, yes. Uh-huh.
So
Now,
during World War
there,
One, where the women were giving the men who were not in uniform a white feather for their cowardice,
yes.
when
Hmm.
World War One was just suicide. You went
Yeah.
and you didn't come home from World
You
War One.
didn't come home, or you came home without any hands. I mean, it was just so horrific. And women by the thousands joined the White Feather campaign, often the very same women who had been involved in the suffrage movement, so full of anger and outrage against men, participated suddenly in the white feather movement to shame men, sometimes men as young as 14 and 15, boys, sometimes wounded men home from, home on leave. They gave them those white feathers. It was part of their whole ideology of sex war. It was an expression of their resentment against men. It was a horrific, horrific thing. And and it, even, I mean, that's a fascinating issue, what women did to men, and the lasting scars that it caused. Apparently,
Mm-hmm.
years after, the a newspaper in Great Britain asked men to write in about their experiences of being given white feathers, and men had carried that shock and bitterness for years, that the women that they cared about had so much callous indifference, and even, a death drive towards them, as to shame them into enlisting in this horrific meat grinder of a war. It's just stunning. But even
Right.
apart from that, if we're going to talk about codes of morality, yes, they are unequally applied. And a man accused of cowardice or weakness is a man shamed.
Mm-hmm.
And women aren't. That's not ever used against women. You can say, well, that was a type of prejudice, that women are expected to be timid. But, come on, like, that's the way it is. When the Titanic went down in April of 1915, nobody expected women to stay on deck and to go down with the ship.
Mm-hmm.
Men handed off their wives into the lifeboats,
Mm-hmm.
knowing that they were going to die, and they had to do it because that was the code of morality. And so again, I don't know, how could you say that was about hatred of women or male power over women, that men were willing to die so that their women folk could live? That was part of the moral code as well. It was about protecting women. It was about upholding the value of women's lives in those cases well over men's, even upper class men. If you look at the lists of the survivors on the Titanic, even in first class, often people argue, oh, well, it was a class issue. No, even in first class, I think the survival rate for men was, oh, I can't remember what it is now. I've researched this. I should remember, but it was appallingly low. The most wealthy millionaires, the Astors,
Mm-hmm.
the Guggenheims, who were on board that ship,
Lost their
they
patriarchs.
they lost their lives, and their wives survived.
Mm-hmm.
So, and many more women in steerage, in the lowest compartment, they survived rather than these upper class men. So yeah, so yes, there was a very sharply defined gender difference in the moral codes of British and American society during this whole period, but it didn't necessarily always disadvantage the woman.
Mm-hmm. Right. Okay. And all right. So let's psychoanalyze this now.
Can we do one more
One, yes,
just before we do?
sure.
Um,
One more for our
yeah,
collection.
the one. Okay, two more actually, because
Okay,
one is just an outright
let's
lie.
go. It's your show, babe.
Willing, might as well say it. Okay, actually, three more. I'm sorry.
Yes, come on,
Okay, the
bring it
one,
on.
he
Let's
he is
go.
he
I've
is
waited for months
monop.
for this interview. Let him have it, Fiamengo. We're
so so we're getting near the end. He has monopolized nearly all the profitable employments, and from those she is permitted to follow. So in other words, women could work. She receives but a scanty remuneration. He closes against her all the avenues to wealth and distinction, which he considers most honorable to himself as a teacher of theology, medicine, or law. She is not known. Okay, this is not entirely a lie, but it is pretty much dishonest. It's not true that most avenues of employment were closed to women. Women worked in this time. They were breaking in at this time into fields of journalism and teaching and academia. Professorships were being given to women. Many women were businessmen,
Woodhull. When was
businesswomen.
Woodhull alive? Was Woodhull contemporary?
Victoria Woodhull she ran for president of the Equal Rights Party, I think, in 1872. So yes, she was a stockbroker. Went around lecturing to packed houses about all her crazy ideas about theosophy and mesmerism, and all sorts of things, and free love and all of that. And yeah, she was very financially successful. There were many women who ran their own businesses. Women could make money as authors. I mean, Harriet Beecher Stowe had published Uncle Tom's Cabin, I think the best-selling novel of the entire 19th century, considered to have essentially, started the Civil War or laid the groundwork for the Civil War. Yeah, women were involved in so many different spheres. They started to become involved in medical practices in the mid 19th century. By the end of the 19th century,
They were
medical
midwives. They were also
schools. Of course,
midwives.
they were midwives, but they were getting medical degrees by the end of the 19th century. So it's true, maybe there weren't that many in 1848, but I mean, it was coming. It is simply not true. And the point about men being paid more, I think that is true largely, and that was the case probably right up until the 1960s, that men, a male school teacher was paid more than a female school teacher, for example. But the reason that he was paid more was that he was understood to probably have I think they had what they even called a family wage. So once the man was married, he would be paid more in many of these professions. And it was
Because he
understood that
was
he was,
expected to support a
yeah,
family.
he was supporting his family. So, okay, maybe that was unfair. I do certainly support equal pay for equal work, but it wasn't unfair in any kind of explicitly anti-woman manner. It was unfair in a pro-family manner, I suppose. So yeah, so that one is not true at all. I studied women in the 19th century in Canada who worked in many, many interesting spheres. One of them was a journalist in the 1880s. She had friends one of whom became a professor of mathematics, another of whom became a doctor specializing in women's illnesses. So, there were all sorts of professional avenues opening for women and women flourishing in them. And that brings us to the next one. He has denied her the facilities for obtaining a thorough education, all colleges being closed against her. Simply wrong. I really have no idea why they put this one in here, as anybody reading it at the time
Would have
and
known.
anybody now would have known it wasn't true. She herself received, Katie Stanton received a great education. Oberlin College opened to women, I think, in 1836. There were all sorts of colleges open to
Oberlin is
women.
not a shabby place. This is one of the great
No, no,
institutions of our times.
absolutely. And there were many highly esteemed colleges, some specifically designed for women to give them the highest standards of education, others that were co-ed. If anyone doubts me, look up the timeline of women's colleges in the United States. It's right there on Wikipedia, and one after the other. I think the first one, well, there were seminaries for women in the late 18th century, but I think the first college was opened in 1803. She would have known this. All of them would have known it. I don't know why they put that there. It's just an outright lie.
Along with many others. But this is really the worst one because she herself was educated
Yes,
at
yes.
Troy Seminary, and
Troy Seminary. I mean, yeah,
everyone knew this.
she knew it, and everybody knew it. Yeah, I mean, and so many women were. I mean, this was a society that really valued education for women. They wanted, I mean, for no other reason, they wanted women, mothers, to be able to educate their children. They wanted women to, exemplify the highest virtues of self-restraint and compassion and knowing the good, all of those things. Well, you couldn't have those if you weren't educated and able to read and able to think for yourself. And anyway, I mean, it's just shocking to me that's there. And then the last one I just wanted to point out is the last one before they make their demand that they should be admitted to all of these rights from which they're excluded. He has endeavored in every way that he could to destroy her confidence in her own powers, to lessen her self-respect, and to make her willing to lead a dependent and abject life. Well, obviously not true. Not true of the hundreds of women who attended this conference, and not true of the many, many women who were involved in public culture in the United States. And yes, if men had really wanted to make women abject and dependent, they would not have allowed them to attend these colleges. They would not have created educational institutions specifically for women, clearly. So yeah, what can you say? And so this is the founding document, and as far as I know, it's never been disavowed by any feminist leader. It's never been admitted that most of the points elaborating on the grievance expressed in the opening paragraph are false. And so what does that mean then? That the entire American women's movement is founded on a series of lies and was specifically intended to whip up shame in the men reading that document and deep anger and resentment in the women reading that document.
Pretty good propaganda.
Yeah.
It got a result.
It got a result, and it has maintained. I mean, I think women today, feminist women, are angrier now probably than
Ever.
before. Yeah.
Well, it would seem that after all of this fuss, you know, going on 200 years of this, that, well, I will put it as a question: are women happier, and do they like being women? You know, that's a very, very important question, and I think that a lot of what this did was it definitely was a declaration of war against men. The Declaration of Independence was a declaration of war against the King of England. And the mockery of the Declaration of Independence here, I'm not that easily offended, but I think this just reeks of bullshit. The plagiarism, the blatant plagiarism, mockery, it's not even, it's too obvious to be plagiarism. It's just buffoonery.
I know. I find it very odd because you're right. Everyone reading it would have known that it was mimicking the Declaration
you couldn't miss it. It's got some of the most famous. We hold these truths to be self-evident. That's Franklin's edit.
Yes.
So everyone educated, which these people were, knows these words, and I think that it filled them with revolutionary fervor. I think that it said, well, this is the second American Revolution, and you know, be there or be square, and basically, but what's amazing is that they still couldn't get above 1 in 3 women supporting suffrage, even at the time of the passage of the 19th.
Yes.
All that, 75 years, 70 years, 68 years, 70-ish years of this, still, they couldn't convince a majority, not even a slim majority. A third is a, wow.
Yeah.
I mean, you know, the thing is that when I learn this stuff, I press you for deeper information like I do everyone else, right? I don't just take what you say, right? We've been talking now for like 6 or 7 years, and I'm like, explain this to me. And I listen to your work critically. I'm paying attention, just like I do the rest of the time. It gets more and more, I don't know what the word is, but I'm pretty pissed off that I ever fell for this crap. And I didn't need this shit to tell me to respect anybody. I didn't need feminism to tell me to respect my mother or to respect the women in my life or my grandmother or my godmother, who was not a feminist of any kind. I didn't need feminism to respect my Aunt Josie.
Yeah. Or to love those women.
No, to love them, to want to protect them. No, absolutely not. You do not need feminism for that. And that's not what feminism is about. In fact, it would seem to reject the love, the protective instinct that many men have toward women, which is wholly innate. It is instinctual. This is not some kind of a conditioned thing. The protectiveness that men have for women. Oh, and now this too is considered sexist?
Yes, that too is sexist. And actually that goes right back to, I'm sure they would have put it in here, you know, if they thought of it. But it goes right back to Mary Wollstonecraft, her vindication of the rights of woman, which she published in 1792. That's one of the
Oh,
many
I must
things
have
that
read
she
this thing.
complains about. I'm sure you did. That she complains about that, too. That men, they have this. She called it like a, and this is still the idea of benevolent sexism. She didn't use that term, of course, but she talked about the sort of sham chivalry that men exhibit towards women, and saw it as a way of demeaning women and putting women in their place, and showing that men, although they pretend to honor women, what they're really doing is demonstrating their own physical and other sorts of superiority. And on the one hand, it's a document demanding that men do all sorts of things for women, and on the other hand, it's a document
Yeah.
telling them that everything they have done for women, thinking it was benevolent, is a sign of their own condescension and contempt for women. And I think that still
Yeah.
characterizes so much of feminist discourse, and especially that rejection, well, not especially, but including the rejection that there is anything innate in men that wants to protect women. Like, it never acknowledges any
Hmm.
source of benevolence or care for women in anything that men have ever done
Yeah.
for women.
Yes. One of the funniest things you ever said in a presentation was, as your fellow English major, that you said, if men hate women this much, where are all the hate letters? No, instead, what you find is libraries full of professions of love and admiration and respect and deification of women. Volumes
I
of
know.
of
Yeah.
this.
Yeah.
Uh,
I know. It's
John Donne's,
amazing, isn't it?
the whole of John Donne's
Yeah.
poetry. He's talking about
Mm.
God or women.
Yeah.
And here's,
Yeah. Yeah. And with the same sort of devotion to each.
well, that's the pun,
Uh,
right? That's the pun, right? That's
yeah.
kind of what I learned in the literature of that era, studying it as well. And all male poets do this,
Hmm.
pretty much,
Yeah.
except for Bob Dylan. Except for Bob
Mhm.
Dylan. Bob Dylan writes the Jesus letter, and then he writes the poison pen letter. You got a lot of nerve to say you are my friend. When I was down, you just stood there grinning. Ah,
Mhm.
so Bob comes along and he blows the whistle on this in the 1960s, and
Mhm.
women love him.
Yes.
A lot of women
Yes.
love Bob Dylan. They he's skin bracer. He's refreshing.
Well, there is a tradition, like the ballad folk tradition also has a lot of stories about evil women, hard-hearted women who
Yes.
betray.
Well,
So there
yes. I
is
sent
that.
you. I sent you. Moshe Ringham Durham Da Whack Fall the
Yeah,
Daddy-O. There's whiskey
exactly,
in the jar.
exactly. That's
But
true.
even
Yes.
that's kind of
Mhm.
lighthearted. Even that is. I mean, it may be understating the case, but yes, there is some acknowledgement of that. But he still brings the money home to his Molly.
Yeah. That's right. Yeah.
Right? He's
Hmm.
not saying "fuck you, bitch. I'm taking this. I'm taking this money and going to the whorehouse," which,
Hmm.
right? That's not what that song's about. It's
Yes.
it's
Yeah.
he has to
Well, yeah,
drink.
there.
She drives him. He drinks. This is why he drinks.
Yeah. Well, I think there's that. Yeah, in those types of ballads, there's often this recognition of the man's his disempowerment, his dependence on the woman's love and her cruelty to him, but he can't
Hmm.
stop caring about her. And so,
Yeah.
yes, there's definitely a tradition of that too. And we don't find that kind of tradition amongst women. Women have been writing poetry for centuries, and there is not any sort of commensurate tradition of women paying to the men they love. Absolutely not. Nothing about how much they love the men, nothing about how much they love the men's minds, certainly no expressions of gratitude or fellow feeling, even
You know.
for their men folks. So,
Oh,
uh,
this
that's
is very
striking.
interesting. So
It's
this
it's
is
very, yeah. I mean, I
this
go
could
back
be.
to the Titanic again,
Mm,
even right after it happened, some women expressed gratitude, but a lot of women groused about it. That they said things like, "Well, why should we feel gratitude for these men? I mean, it was men who built the ship.
ah,
So,
come on.
like, I'm serious. Yeah, no, I read a I read a whole book about the cultural context of the Titanic,
It
and it
was
had a
men
whole
who built
chapter
the
on
ship.
women's. Yeah, it was men who built the
If
ship. It's
ladies had
women.
built that ship, if Rosie the
It's there.
Riveter had been around, that
It
would have been
wouldn't have gone
fine.
down. Yes, they said it's because
Sure.
of men. It was men's fault. So what men should have died. Why should women die for men's inadequate construction? And if women had more power, we would have because women care about life more. A lot of women said that, and that was part of the feminist movement as well. That if women had power, all wars would cease.
Mm.
Children would be better
Yes.
cared for, all
Yes.
that
There
stuff,
was a
because women are
campaign. Yeah,
nurturers.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Campaign promises
Absolutely.
came with this. We will fix
Yes.
society.
Yeah.
And
We're
this
going
is
to fix
all over
everything.
the displays at
Yeah.
Seneca Falls. Oh, they're
Yeah.
reading the letters. There's a movie where they're reading the actual letters. They take the actual correspondence of the women and they dramatize it in a film, like a
Mm,
propaganda film that's been shown like
mm,
25,000 times, like Ronald Reagan
yes.
telling us about the new forthcoming space shuttle, which you can still see at the Air and Space Museum. And still, the last time I was there, it was still Ronald Reagan with the stretchy videotape. It wasn't quite that bad, but the women are
Mm,
saying things like, well, if only women were in charge, we wouldn't have these terrible, brutal wars. We
yes.
would we would heal the ills of society. We would make everything better. And this is what they're telling each other.
Yeah. 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 And that is a strand that starts at the very beginning, and of course is still very dominant. That notion that if women had total power, everything would be fine. Complete utopian vision. And yet when women continually have more power, every year we elect more women to government. We have more women CEOs. We have more women running the military or whatever it happens to be. And they don't take responsibility for the failure of that utopian vision to come true. There's always some reason why that glad day has not yet occurred. And it's never women's fault. That's why
Yeah, yeah. I was gonna say yes.
anti-feminism.
It's got to be about the guys. So
Oh, yes, it's always a man's fault. It always is, or at least it is male dominant ways of thinking that still persist.
yeah, right.
Yeah, it's you can find that it's fascinating to read memoirs by feminist activists, especially of the second wave, who, in the 90s and early 21st century started writing their memoirs. And many of them were quite concerned by the nastiness of women in the movement, the backbiting, the rivalries, the betrayals, and also the evidence that women were not doing well, the mental illness, the raging, the hysteria, the
Hmm.
breakdowns, the suicides, all that sort of stuff. But often they would say, oh, it's because we hadn't yet fully shaken off male ways of thinking and relating to one another. So there's always an out, and it's that's another discouraging aspect of
Hmm.
women's power, is the unwillingness to take responsibility. And I started to say that's why my favorite slogan is, just in opposition to the feminist slogan, which is feminism is the radical idea that
That
women
women
are
are people.
human,
Yeah.
as if, as if ever that was ever doubted. Anti-feminism is the radical idea that women are adults. And I don't see that
No.
amongst most feminist inspired women today. They still act like children. They make an awful lot of demands. They exhibit an awful lot of resentment, and they do not take responsibility for their own callousness, their own failures of empathy, or their inadequacies. And that would be a really radical thing, I think, would be
Hmm.
for women to practice genuine empathy for the men in their lives, to think with some gratitude about the civilizations that men built and the things men did to empower
Hmm.
women, and to
Hmm.
recognize their own failings.
No, there's never one thing I figured out even before I met you is there's no hall of fame for men who have stuck their neck out for women, gotten them published, gotten their work, protected their identities when they
Yes.
were
Hmm.
passing as
Yeah.
men. There's not a peep about this. And
Oh no.
it of course has been the
Thousands and thousands of men, who done all sorts of things, that advances in childbirth, for example, to make it less painful for women. Advances in the domestic economy, like the creation of dishwashers and all sorts of labor-saving devices.
Hmm.
Like if men were tyrants, why would they do any of those things? They'd want women to continue to suffer and to have to labor away.
Yeah.
But they haven't done. They've cared.
Yeah. Yeah. So one last thing, there a lot of the this is basically this is dismissed. There's no validity to this in my opinion.
I don't think so.
But
No.
it's a hack. It's a really good hack. Like it really caught on. It really kind of went
Yeah.
viral, and it
Yeah.
inflamed gender rage, and it inflamed rage against other women because it splits women. There
Yes,
used
of
to be a
course.
satire act called Ladies Against Women. And this
Mhm.
really kind of and there's, yeah, I'm kind of tongue tied here. And there's no, let's grow the fuck up and be adults and let's take responsibility and share the power equally and share the responsibilities equally. Mixed
Yeah.
in with all of this is a slander campaign claiming that men are basically all sexually depraved. I didn't
Yeah.
get how bad this was or how far it went back. Now, who was the little prissy one that I sent you? Did I send you her picture? She's a little bit after. She's a
Um,
little bit later in the century than Stanton. She becomes a
yeah.
knight. She becomes dame.
It was it Christabel
Yeah.
Pankhurst? Is that the one? Yeah.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
And so, but it
Yes.
goes back the notion. Oh God, what a nice queen! The notion that men are all a bunch of whoring,
Yeah.
sexually perverted louts seems to be inherent in
Yes.
feminism from the first days.
Hmm.
Uh,
Yes, it is.
right?
Yeah.
How would you
Yeah.
describe this?
Yes. Well, I mean, yeah, it starts with campaigns around prostitution, feminist insistence that the issue of prostitution was entirely an issue of male sexual depravity, and that prostitutes were the ultimate symbol of female sex slavery in society, and that that symbol applied also to women in all other areas of their lives, that women in marriages were also sex slaves. It's a Marxist idea, actually. Engels, who wrote The Origin of the Family, Private Property, and the State in, I think, 1884, based on Marx's papers after Marx's death, made that, he transferred the idea of the capitalist oppressor and the oppressed worker. He translated that, transported it into the family. And so the man becomes the oppressor, the husband, and the woman is the sex slave of the man. So that became a very popular idea amongst feminists, who seized on that notion that sex slavery essentially summed up the relation of man and woman. And then you get, yeah, the suffragettes. Christabel Pankhurst was a primary leader of the suffragette movement in Great Britain, and she wrote that tract about syphilis, about venereal
The
disease, the
gonorrhea. She
great,
claimed 80% of men.
yeah,
No,
yeah, I
that
mean,
80% of
crazy,
women were infected with gonorrhea
yeah,
from their
mhm,
whoring husbands, and
husbands,
then
yeah,
further, this was the most outrageous statement that the men go to these prostitutes because they want to commit unnatural, whatever the heck that means,
yeah,
unnatural sexual acts.
yes,
I wonder if she ever once talked to a prostitute in her entire life,
hmm, I'm
much less
sure
visited
probably
a
not,
brothel to see what was going on there. And
yeah,
at least Erica
mhm,
Jong hung out in the S&M salon and wrote a brilliant article, "Is Sex Sexy Without Power?" Erica Jong always had a slightly different view on things, but going back to the 19th century, I was amazed to hear how disparaging of men's sexuality so
hmm,
many of
yes,
these women were, and how this was a central plank in the
yeah.
platform of why we needed to get the men out of power because they're
Yeah,
perverts.
they're perverts. Yeah, very much. Yeah, I know exactly. It is there in most of the major feminists. Even at the same time as some of them were advocates of free love.
Yes,
So
this
they
is
felt,
twisted. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Please,
yeah, it's
please
really
say more.
weird
Please say
that,
more.
yeah, female sexuality, just like today. I mean, I think it's the strand runs straight into the modern world. But yeah, female sexuality is pure. It needs to be liberated, and it never harms anyone. And so, therefore, we never need to worry about it. It shouldn't be restrained in any way. But male sexuality is evil. It must be restrained. And women are the ones, of course, who must restrain it. And that is a very powerful idea amongst the suffrage advocates. And it continued, I think I've told you about that amazing moment in Simone de Beauvoir's The Second Sex, when she talks about how one of the, the male is the, dominant actor in the sexual act. He's the one that determines what position will be used. He's the one that, she goes into this sort of micro analysis of everything. He's the one who determines how long the sexual act will continue. And even at the end, when he says, "Did you come?" that is an expression of his contempt for the woman, because he wants to control her and force her into orgasm as an expression of his sexual power. So yeah, that just the dislike of male sexuality, the misunderstanding of it, and the total inability to believe that it could be anything other than an expression of really hatred and power over, which comes to its fullest fruition in Andrea Dworkin and Catherine McKinnon's theories, but it's there so much earlier. That is a
Yes,
really
yeah, 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 yeah,
remarkable,
yeah, yeah.
worrisome aspect.
Yes,
Yeah,
because
sorry.
I'm thinking this male hating of feminism, this all sex is rape kind of
Yeah,
feminism, uh, is Dworkin in writing in like 1980, but it's
yes,
a century older, at least a
yeah,
century older than this,
it
and
is.
she's just carrying on the tradition.
Yeah. Yeah,
And
it's there in the earliest feminist advocates for sure. Yeah, yeah,
so I wonder what let's say there was a need for some of social reform, which seemed to already be happening in 1848. There were colleges opening up, and women were learning trades, and they were
yeah,
being taught to read and write. Women were teaching in schools. Women in all these one-room
yeah,
schoolhouses. All the teachers were women. There weren't guys teaching in these one-room schoolhouses.
yeah,
What would have happened without this kind of
yeah,
vicious propaganda campaign?
yeah. What, I mean, we can only dream of what might have been, because I can't imagine that. I don't know. I absolutely believe that the advancement towards women's fuller participation in society would have occurred, because it
Mm-hmm.
was indeed occurring, and it
Mm-hmm.
kept occurring
Mm-hmm.
as a result of all sorts of changes in technology and social arrangements.
Yes,
I
yes,
think
yes,
that
yes,
would have
yes, yes.
happened. And but you know what, I don't know, I think my I've come to the rather unhappy conclusion that the resentment of women against men is actually a female issue. And therefore, even if there hadn't been the particular form of the feminist movement that we have seen develop, I think there would have been expressions of anger at men, because I think there is something deep seated in female nature that is resentful and angry. And as you said, women have not become happier. And that is one of the most striking things about our contemporary moment, is the anger and resentment of women. And every study proves it, that women are less happy than they were in the 1970s. Why?
Mm-hmm.
And what does that say about
Mm-hmm.
what does that say about women's ability to determine what
It's
they
good for them.
want?
Yeah, what they
Yeah,
want
is
and
what
what's
is
good for
good
them.
for them. And we were talking earlier about women's happiness, and I've actually come around to the idea that that's part of the problem, is that I don't think any social
Movement can, yeah.
movement, yeah, it can't give happiness, and it shouldn't even be concerned with happiness, certainly not female happiness in particular. When have we ever had a movement that said, let's make men happier? No, what we want to do is we want to make people better, and we want to create societies that flourish and that are good for children in particular. The feminist movement has definitely not been good for children. And women, feminists, have actually stopped even pretending that they care very much about children. Even in the Declaration of Sentiments, that thing about how divorce took place without a concern for women's happiness.
Ah.
Well, you know, so, that is that, I mean, what is happiness? The ancients talked
Yeah.
a lot, and the Christian fathers and, philosophers have talked a lot about happiness. It's not a feeling. It's not where you wake up every day feeling
Ah.
good about yourself. Yay. It's the pursuit of virtue. It's contributing something to your society. It's
Yeah.
choosing the good and thinking deeply about what the good is. And I don't see feminists rather, I don't see them very interested in that at all. And so naturally, if you have a movement that's all about women's happiness, that doesn't care about the good and doesn't care about anyone but adult women or some girl children, perhaps, certainly doesn't care about boy babies or boy children, and certainly doesn't care about men. If you have that kind of a movement, naturally it's going to go off the rails because it
Yeah.
doesn't have a notion of the social good except women's empowerment. And so I guess
This is this
in
is
an
so go, please, sorry to interrupt
I
you.
just would say in an ideal world, I suppose women and men would have worked together to pursue the good. But I think that would involve I mean, I'm not good on this kind of large picture stuff, but it would involve having to talk about the fact that women and men have a nature, which of course feminism totally disavows. Everything is social constructionist. It
Yeah.
was like that back as far as Mary Wollstonecraft. So you'd have to recognize that women and men generally as a group have different natures, and also that individuals have different natures. And you would have to work out how those natures best, the capacities of both individuals and groups, how those capacities can be harnessed and how they can contribute to a flourishing society that's good for all, and especially for the most vulnerable children. So yeah, that would be the ideal.
Yeah. And a spirit of let's work this out together.
For sure.
We're building this household or this village or this community together. Let's work this out. Let's work out a fair power sharing arrangement and responsibility sharing arrangement. To me, one of the deepest disappointments of my life was I totally fell for women's lib as a legitimate movement with legitimate grievances. And I have always been waiting for the perfect feminist woman who believed in equality and sharing the work and helping pay the bills, and we support one another because we're both people. And I started to realize most women that I met were not really interested in any form of equality. They just were not interested in it. And I have also found that when treated as equals, most women do not respond well to actual fair treatment and respect of their equality, that women tend to respond better when you kind of take charge.
Yeah.
And I personally resent this, but I've learned to just go with it and be like, look, I got a business to run. I've got a life to live. I have the work that I do, and I'm not here to pretend that something that is not is. And so if I've got to take charge, I take charge. And I hope to have cooperative people. But yes, I fell for it so much that I waited for it in relationships, and it was never forthcoming. And now I can see the many, many reasons why it is not. When there's a commotion out on the street, it's broken glass, I am out there.
You're out there.
I can't imagine very many women being being like, "What? Oh, I heard a police just the other night. A cop had to tackle a guy through a fucking plate glass window in my neighbor's building, and he got away with minimal injuries, but he could have easily been cut in half by this. And I was down there at 4 o'clock in the morning with the cops, seeing what was up. 1,000, multiply that by 1,000 times, from
Yes,
volunteer fire
exactly.
departments and so forth.
Yeah.
It is the men going into the burning buildings to get the women and the cats and the kids out.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
this could again be portrayed as sexism. I don't want to step on the incredible conversation that we have had here. I would encourage my viewers and listeners to really think things through again. I am finding that a lot of women have figured this out for themselves. They're really looking askance at these essentially bigoted loudmouths who have kind of ruined being a woman for a tremendous number of women who just want to be women and work it out with guys. There is a natural inclination to want to do that unless it is provoked into revolutionary fervor.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Which it still is to this day.
It sure is. Yeah. In fact, it seems to me that rage has never been so prominent an aspect of an organized movement, and the celebration of rage is somehow purifying and liberating. I find it really disturbing. And I think that the worst elements of female nature are encouraged by all that revolutionary fervor, and the best elements are not even recognized. So it's a shame.
But here we are. We still have the option to be fair to each other.
Yeah.
And to respect each other.
Individuals do, and men are still interested, I think, in forming partnerships with women. And I think women have a lot of social power to be able to individually and in groups speak up and say, feminism doesn't speak for me. And one of my dreams is to have a day every year where we have a march called, Women and Families Against Feminism, or against feminist man-hating bigotry. And I just think it would be fun. You could get together a whole bunch of different groups, maybe with totally different objectives and philosophies, but all adamant that we do not want to continue to pretend that men are the enemy. And in fact, we want to speak out against that in a very loud voice. And I'd love to see more women saying that they don't want to have any part of it.
Well, it should start right here in Kingston. I think that would be a very appropriate place for it, because the cradle, we're here in the cradle of the American civilization. The New York State Senate met like about 100 feet for the first time in that direction. Yeah, toward Fair Street.
Wow.
And the assembly about 3 blocks down. And where my office and home are is inside this thing called the Stockade, which was an 800-foot fortress built by Dutch settlers to protect the women and the children, so the guys could farm the fields outside and withstand the attacks from the Indians outside the fortress. And then the fields were all out there, and then they'd come home at night and they'd, presumably the fire would be warm and dinner would be waiting after they had risked their lives all day growing food.
Yeah. Wow.
Right in this very spot, the Stockade. It's called the Stockade. Yep. So anyway, Janice, thank you. Really, you have become one of the most important people ever in my life, helping me understand what has happened to me and how I formed the views that I formed. And I think you're a fantastic scholar. I mean, I think you're just a fucking rock star scholar. And I love your work and your cool, calm response to all of this complete lunacy.
Thank you very much. Yeah. I loved having this conversation, and I really appreciate your appreciation.
Good. Well, there you go. So let me say goodbye, and thank you again. And ladies and gentlemen, this has been Professor of English, retired Janice Fiamengo, who has kind of led a parallel life that I might have, if I could only have been an English professor. So good.
Okay. Thank you, Eric.